This is it's going to be an interesting presentation because it's not necessarily a how-to. We're going to teach you exactly how to do something. It's not that. It is a recognition that a lot of the tools that we've used for the past 10, 15 years are getting a little dated. Things have changed quite a bit in the way that decisions need to be made, the speed at which they need to be made, and the way that we need to communicate and socialize that stuff internally as well. And so I'm going to share with you just a collection of tools that I've used over the years, and our company has adopted many of these. Not all of them, but many of these. And it's not that I want you to focus on that particular tool. I want you to focus on the gap that you might have in your own toolkit and try to explore things that could help you fill that particular gap. All right, so what I hope that everybody gets out of this is these three things right here. Is number one, to expand your toolbox. So whatever you've got, keep it. It's like, tools in your house. You never get rid of them. You just get more and accumulate it. To be able to speak with some more authority. More and more often, we're finding that loyalty results are challenged or methods are being challenged. Earlier in Shamba's presentation, I was wondering when they said, okay, what's one of the things you find challenging? I was waiting for somebody to say attribution. Attribution is a challenge that we're seeing everywhere. And it's not that, hey, we don't know how to prove the results of a marketing treatment. It's that there's just sometimes 10, 15 touches with the customer before an action is even taken. So where do you place the value on the next investment? And that's harder and harder to do. And that diminishes our authority. And so there's some tools that we've learned along the way to help you regain that authority, to move from being an expert to more of a facilitator of a corporate conversation. And then the last part is to help you deal with the fact that there's way too many things for you to do right now. So how do you prioritize, communicate, and make trade-offs, and do that with some conviction? So that you can equally say, I'm focused on these things, as well as you can say, and here's why I'm not doing these other things over here. The ability to say why you're not working on something or focusing on something is way more powerful than getting people to understand why you're working on something else, okay? Because that's where the distractions happen. Who knows where this is from? This is the Cheshire Cat. That's not what the picture is, but the Cheshire Cat is talking to Alice, and she's lost, and she says, I'm lost. I don't know where to go. And the cat says, well, where are you trying to go? And she's like, I don't know. He's like, well, any path will get you there. just go ahead then if you don't know where you're going. And oftentimes we feel like this, and we don't start out this way. Like, we know what our objectives are. Like I said, what's the objective of your loyalty program? It's going to sound something like ROI, retain customers. It's going to be about engagement. It's going to be these buzzwords that are going to be all throughout every program of every loyalty conference that you're going to see for the next 2 years. But somehow we still feel lost in the midst of trying to make all that stuff come to life. And we'll talk about why that happens and how to get through it. Quick blurb about Kobie here, where the company that I work for. We power loyalty programs for some of the top global brands. Right? We do this regionally, we do this globally, we work in all of these verticals that you see right here, in addition to some other ones that we don't actually have named verticals for, but our programs are pretty well known. Our mission is that we grow enterprise value through loyalty, and that means two things to me. Number one is that when we do something, we bring it all the way to the bottom line. That means that we're not just, hey, we're here to influence and hope that it makes money. We want to make sure that we can bring it all the way down to the bottom line. And number two, that we call our shots. We don't just, hit all the balls around the table and see what goes in and say, that was us. Like, we need to make sure that we're saying, hey, we're specifically trying to do this thing. We're going to call what it's going to do. But that's our mission, and you're going to see that financial acumen goes all the way throughout this presentation. So if finance stuff bores you, you have no recourse because Len's talking about finance in the other room also. Okay. All right, so let's talk about what our lives look like. There's this series of things that occur. A question arises, and in this group we've got loyalty practitioners. Some are experts in providing services to clients. Others are clients who are responsible for managing this kind of stuff, and other people just kind of sit and help facilitate those conversations. But a question arises, and we all have to solve for these things. And it's something like, hey, should I leverage this partner as an option in my loyalty program? Should I use their services to help my customers? And then what happens? Some analysis or some information is gathered, All right, so data is gathered and an analysis is completed. Sound familiar so far? Right? But let me just slow down for a second because this is not theory, this is real stuff. When we go gather data for that analysis, it's often like, I don't even know where that stuff is, or I've got to go find it, or it's in the junk drawer over here. Billy worked on that before. Where's Billy? Oh, he's at the competitor now. Does anybody have his number? Like that's our lives. That's what we actually go through. And then what happens? A decision is made. A plan of action is taken. But does everybody align to that? Right? So direction is set. Communication happens internally. And a decision is made that we all get behind. I feel like more often than not, we make a decision and then we go on a mission to try to get people to buy into that decision. And they weren't part of the original pain to begin with. And then my favorite part is execution. All right, and then we act. I don't know how many times we've gone through analysis on behalf of our clients, on behalf of ourselves, and it just doesn't go anywhere because while that was a good idea, something else came up that's now more urgent, that's now burning, and we really don't actually do what we say we're going to do through this process. And if we get to that point where you make a decision, the question is, how long does that decision last for? How long is that thing valid for? And I consider all of this to be the chase. There's a problem. I just wanted to know if I should bring on this partner. And then we're dealing with this aftermath for a long time. And before we can get all of that right, another question arises. Are my incentives even effective? And this question has evolved over time since we first started asking it. Now it's more like, are my incentives effective for each segment? Are these incentives cost effective for each dynamic segment? And it's getting more complicated, the questions that we're asking. Do my incentives detract from emotional connection? Wow, there's this whole other thing flying in from the left. And to what extent are my customers willing to trade off these things? Now we're asking new questions, bigger questions, and a lot of them. And they keep coming and coming and coming and coming. And finally somebody else asks in the middle of all your hard work, is this program even effective? Right? Is this thing doing what it's supposed to do? And if I listed out all of the questions that we could be asked, it's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And that's why our job is so complicated, is because we're responsible for really managing the work, and there's no end to the reactionary things that we can do. And the urgent becomes more of the thing that we do than the important. And if you've ever felt that, my gosh, I've got all this stuff that I have to do that's urgent, but I can't get to this important stuff, then welcome. You're with the rest of us. And hopefully I'm going to provide a bit of a framework that might help you sort some of that stuff out. All right, loyalty marketer's job is to balance competing objectives. You've got this financial responsibility over here to make money for the company. That's what ultimately every CFO is going to say. This is why these programs are here. But over here, there's a true purpose. It doesn't sound like make the company money. We want to put a Coke in the hand of every consumer in the world. Like that's a mission. That's not make money. Make money is a requirement for this true purpose. And often those people aren't talking to each other, and you're in the middle of that. And then you've got this program construct, which are the laws by which you're living within, and all of this day-to-day tactical, promotional stuff, reactionary things, and you're trying to figure out how much of this can compensate for a problem in that before I have to change that thing over there. And all of this should be data-driven, and the job of the loyalty marketer is to balance all of that stuff. Sound familiar? Okay, we're all tracking, good. You guys are like, welcome to my world. All right. So we're going to try to organize this into 3 groups. All right, one is you've got these big picture construct level questions. You've got some operating questions that help you with your day-to-day. And then you've got relevancy questions. Okay, let me talk about each one. The construct questions are the ones that say, hey, do I need to attack the very foundation of the thing that we're doing for our customers? Is it time? Did we mess up with the last one? Is it too soon to introduce something new? Right? Should I add a second or third one? We've got a client that's got 3 different programs for 3 different types of customers, and it works out quite well for them. That's not going to work for every brand. Operating questions. What are the things I should be looking at every single day? Where's my little dashboard with red blinking lights that tells me that something's going wrong? And then finally, this last one, relevancy. Is this competitive? Does this even make sense to the customer? So when you think about that giant list of questions, and I'll show you some more as we go, try to bucket them into here. And what we'll talk about today are a modern approach to performance models. We'll go through a living economic model versus some of the models that you might have used in the past, prioritization tools, and the importance of communication. If you're going to invest in anything this year, it's your ability to communicate and influence people throughout your organization. I would do that before any language or leadership course or whatever. It should be all about how much you should be able to communicate people without having them report to you. Second part, dashboard. Like, what should go into this? We'll talk about value drivers. We'll talk about auditable tools. And you need to have a point of view on measurement of the things that matter to your organization. The last part is value checks, the business value drivers, customer value drivers, and then some way to visualize your program, like so that it doesn't just sound like a bunch of words on paper. All right, let's get into it. Who has a financial model that they use? Have you ever heard the term accounting model? Are they interchangeable? Economic model? Like, people call these things all the same thing, but they're very different. And so I'm going to go through them very quickly. And I want you to ask yourself which one you use today and what the benefit might be of advancing into something more like an economic model. So an accounting model is black and white. It tells you what happened in the past, right? It adds things up. It shows the negatives and says this is what it is. This is an accounting model. Here's what you got out of your program. A financial model looks the other direction. It brings forecasting into the mix. It brings it into net present value, so you can see things in equal terms for today. But it also starts to introduce this element of risk, of likelihood to happen. We think it's heading over here, but it could be here, and it could be here. And that matters, because we don't want to talk about things just in terms of absolutes. We want to talk about things in terms of ranges, what things likely to be. Economic models removes the fact that it's not just, or introduces the fact that it's not just money that we're talking about. Yes, we want all this money, but also we want customer satisfaction. Yes, I want the greatest return on investment, but I want to reach as many customers as possible. Which you can have those competing objectives, you just have to be able to make a trade-off. How much ROI are you willing to give up for a certain number of customer reach, and so on and so forth. And it makes you kind of the crossroads, like the traffic cop of the organization, if you can speak to both and the willingness to trade those off. And I'll say this, you're actually the only person in the organization that is equipped to do that. So if it's not something that you do, take that on right now, because you become the most important person in the company, because you become the Rosetta Stone between finance, between marketing, operations, and everything with the customer. It's happened to me more than once as we've gone to kick off a loyalty program. And we're seeing big companies all sitting around a table. We're watching introductions happen. And I remember very clearly this one very large program, people saying, we've never been in the same room together talking about the customer at the same time. And I think that's fascinating that companies exist and this still happens today. All right, so clients request financial models for a lot of reasons, but I want to point out some of the differences in why programs actually exist. So some familiar programs that are up here, non-financial reasons, but if you look at American Airlines or a lot of loyalty programs for airlines, it's about ancillary revenue and retention. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can say that, but that's largely why they exist. So what do? They look at partner effectiveness, engagement, share of wallet. Those are the things that you might measure. AMC is very different. If you've ever been to an AMC theater, it is about total customer engagement. So they've got 3 different programs. They're looking for customer coverage. They want to see migration. They want to see offer uptake. Those are the things that they're looking for. But it's a little different than what American is doing. Who remembers My Coke Rewards? You screw off the cap, you see the code, you go and you type it in. What a boring process for a loyalty program. Go and type this thing in. Doesn't Coke have some kind of money to make it so you don't have to type this in? Don't they have the technology to do it? Their purpose was not American Airlines' purpose or AMC's purpose. They wanted more time spent on the brand. They wanted to double the amount of time drinking a Coke, looking at a Coke can took you out of your day. So going to the website Having to type this thing in was exactly what they wanted. It was marketing impressions and time that is spent on brand. And so the things that you measure for success, in addition to the financials, really matter when you articulate back to the board, back to the company, what's going on and how successful these things are. All right. So when talking about loyalty finance, and I'm just knowing who's in the audience, I don't really need to tell you too much about this right here because you've done so many of these models, right? But you're experts in loyalty and you understand the impact of decisions, and you are the voice of those decisions on the customer experience. You're not anything that starts with an A. You're not a financial advisor, an attorney, an auditor, an actuary. That's Len next door, right? Or an accountant. And to keep yourself out of trouble, you want to remember that that's your role, because these things often require accreditation, certification, and can get you into trouble if you're saying, here's exactly how much you're going to make out of this program. You're influencing and advising. That's what you really want to do. All right. So first step when looking at the financials, one of the tools that you really need to be able to articulate the value of a program, this is a great place to start right over here. We're looking at return on investment, and you're going to see some costs, you're going to see some revenues, and everybody can kind of follow that. What are the things that add up to revenues? What are the things that add up to cost? And then you look at your costs and you break those down, What becomes interesting is that this first thing right here, it's always the same. It's always the same in every organization. We know what ROI is. We know what revenues are. Those things sound familiar. But as program constructs change, this last part is very different. It depends on tiers, it depends on incentives, accelerators, and all that kind of stuff. This stuff up front, very easy to explain to finance, and you should take that advantage. But this stuff over here is very hard. So you've got to really focus on your interpretation skills. You've got to focus on your ability to communicate. And you need to make sure that you have a voice so that finance understands why you need an accelerator, why you have multiple tiers, why you're bringing in an experience. Because they won't get it on their own. They're not dumb. It's just not the language that they actually speak. We live in Florida. This is actually one of the famous ones. This is the one that Trump did the extra little circle on. I don't know if you guys remember that forecast thing. But financial forecasts are very much like hurricane paths. And one of the biggest mistakes, or it's a disappointment because everybody puts so much work into a financial model, is they do a one-time forecast and say, let me know how it goes. Right? They just whoo, send it out. And look at the range on a hurricane path. It could be, I live right there in that thing right there. Okay, so if I'm going to go somewhere to get out of the storm, I got to go to Alabama where my brother lives. Right? That's what I have to do to get away from the storm. And if I relied on this 8 p.m. Saturday forecast, I would have to leave the state. Well, we do that to our clients by saying, here's where your financial forecast is going, good luck. Right? And you actually miss out on an opportunity to have a bigger retainer and all that kind of stuff, because what you could say is, hey, I'm gonna tell you how things went 1 hour into this hurricane. I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna remeasure, and we're gonna narrow that focus. I'm gonna remeasure, and I'm gonna narrow. I'm gonna remeasure, and I'm gonna narrow. And every time I narrow, I'm gonna communicate throughout the organization. We expected this to happen, this is what happened. Micro, small, little disappointments. Versus a year later, you told me this thing was going to make $20 million and it was 14, right? That's a problem, right? They need you to do that, right? Your finance department wants that kind of security. So please, whatever exercise you did here, update your assumptions. Like, look and see how things are actually performing, and move away from just this kind of throw it across the fence and see how it goes. All right. So we talked about, this actually has nothing to do with loyalty. This is just something I pulled off the internet, so you don't need to try to understand it too much. But when we look at a certain number of customer reach and so on and so forth, and it makes you kind of the crossroads, like the traffic cop of the organization if you can speak to both and the willingness to trade those off. And I'll say this, you're actually the only person in the organization that is equipped to do that. So if it's not something that you do, take that on right now, because you become the most important person in the company, because you become the Rosetta Stone between finance, between marketing, operations, and everything with the customer. it's happened to me more than once as we've gone to kick off a loyalty program. And we're seeing big companies all sitting around a table. We're watching introductions happen. And I remember very clearly this one very large program, people saying, we've never been in the same room together talking about the customer at the same time. And I think that's fascinating that companies exist and this still happens today. All right. So clients request financial models for a lot of reasons. But I want to point out some of the differences in why programs actually exist. So some familiar programs that are up here, non-financial reasons, but if you look at American Airlines or a lot of loyalty programs for airlines, it's about ancillary revenue and retention. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can say that, but that's largely why they exist. So what do? They look at partner effectiveness, engagement, share of wallet. Those are the things that you might measure. AMC is very different. If you've ever been to an AMC theater, it is about total customer engagement. So they've got 3 different programs. They're looking for customer coverage. They want to see migration. They want to see offer uptake. Those are the things that they're looking for. But it's a little different than what American is doing. Who remembers My Coke Rewards? You screw off the cap, you see the code, you go and you type it in. What a boring process for a loyalty program. Go and type this thing in. Doesn't Coke have some kind of money to make it so you don't have to type this in? Don't they have the technology to do it? Their purpose was not American Airlines' purpose or AMC's purpose. They wanted more time spent on the brand. They wanted to double the amount of time drinking a Coke, looking at a Coke can took you out of your day. So going to the website, having to type this thing in was exactly what they wanted. It was marketing impressions and time that is spent on brand. And so the things that you measure for success, in addition to the financials, really matter when you articulate back to the board, back to the company, what's going on and how successful these things are. All right. So when talking about loyalty finance, and I don't need to, I'm just knowing who's in the audience, I don't really need to tell you too much about this right here because you've done so many of these models, right? But you're experts in loyalty and you understand the impact of decisions, and you are the voice of those decisions on the customer experience. You're not anything that starts with an A. You're not a financial advisor, an attorney, an auditor, an actuary. That's Len next door, right? Or an accountant. And to keep yourself out of trouble, you want to remember that that's your role, because these things often require accreditation, certification, and can get you into trouble if you're saying, here's exactly how much you're going to make out of this program. You're influencing and advising. That's what you really want to do. All right. So first step when looking at the financials, one of the tools that you really need to be able to articulate the value of a program, this is a great place to start right over here. We're looking at return on investment, and you're going to see some costs, you're going to see some revenues, and everybody can kind of follow that. What are the things that add up to revenues? What are the things that add up to cost? And then you look at your costs and you break those down, What becomes interesting is that this first thing right here, it's always the same. It's always the same in every organization. We know what ROI is. We know what revenues are. Those things sound familiar. But as program constructs change, this last part is very different. It depends on tiers, it depends on incentives, accelerators, and all that kind of stuff. This stuff up front, very easy to explain to finance, and you should take that advantage. But this stuff over here is very hard. So you've got to really focus on your interpretation skills. You've got to focus on your ability to communicate. You need to make sure that you have a voice so that finance understands why you need an accelerator, why you have multiple tiers, why you're bringing in an experience, because they won't get it on their own. They're not dumb. It's just not the language that they actually speak. So one example, we live in Florida. This is actually one of the famous ones. This is the one that Trump did the extra little circle on. And you guys remember that forecast thing? But financial forecasts are very much like hurricane paths. And one of the biggest mistakes, or it's a disappointment because everybody puts so much work into a financial model, is they do a one-time forecast and say, let me know how it goes. Right? They just whoo, send it out. And look at the range on a hurricane path. It could be, I live right there in that thing right there. Okay, so if I'm gonna go somewhere to get out of the storm, I gotta go to Alabama where my brother lives. Right? That's what I have to do to get away from the storm. And if I relied on this 8 p.m. Saturday forecast, I would have to leave the state. Well, we do that to our clients by saying, here's where your financial forecast is going, good luck. Right? And you actually miss out on an opportunity to have a bigger retainer and all that kind of stuff, because what you could say is, hey, I'm gonna tell you how things went 1 hour into this hurricane. I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna remeasure, and we're gonna narrow that focus. I'm gonna remeasure, and I'm gonna narrow. I'm gonna remeasure, and I'm gonna narrow. And every time I narrow, I'm gonna communicate throughout the organization. We expected this to happen, this is what happened. Micro, small, little disappointments. Versus a year later, you told me this thing was going to make $20 million and it was 14, right? That's a problem, right? They need you to do that, right? Your finance department wants that kind of security. So please, whatever exercise you did here, update your assumptions. Like, look and see how things are actually performing, and move away from just this kind of throw it across the fence and see how it goes. All right. So we talked about, this actually has nothing to do with loyalty. This is just something I pulled off the internet, so you don't need to try to understand it too much. But when we look at all of the things that were in that decision tree that influences ROI at the very end, a Monte Carlo simulation looks like this. Who's heard of one of these before? Yeah, people really geek out on the numbers, like, oh, I mean, of course, right? But a lot of people don't. Ask somebody on your team, one of your analysts, to do one of these for you, and it'll be the greatest day of their young life to sit and perform a Monte Carlo simulation. And what you're seeing here are a number of variables that affect an outcome. That's all this is. And it's prioritized by impact. And the level, the width of these bars tells you how much of an impact is there. So if you added up all of the area of these bars up to here, it might not be as impactful as that one thing all the way up there. Anybody who's bought a home and saw what the effective interest rate is, that tiny little number interest rate, has on how much you pay over time, you know what I'm talking about here. But this seems rudimentary, prioritizing your stuff. It's not. People don't do this. They look at the flashing thing that they're getting yelled at over and say, I have to go fix that. Do this so you can know with certainty where the greatest impact is. And every time we do this, two things pop out. Number one, there's something that our clients think is incredibly important, and it's not. And there's something that they think they should just ignore completely, and it has massive impact. One of those is often chasing after the highest value customers. Everybody's chasing after your highest value customers. That next level down, not so much. So bang for your buck, chasing after the next level down, you often get more results than you do trying to retain your highest value customers. Sounds counterintuitive, but because of the competitive nature of who's after them, you can get better results because of that. All right, so let's go back to this, right? We talked about maybe looking at that forecast from today and not just looking at it from way out in the future, but being able to monitor, update, communicate, and adjust. So operating questions get a little different. Let me get a pulse check from everybody, because I know this is dry stuff and it's afternoon. Is this exciting? Interesting? Okay, like, yeah, it's interesting, but I'll need a refresher later. Okay, let's talk about a dashboard. I've seen all sorts of dashboards, I've used all sorts of dashboards, created many of them, but you do need one. Okay, and remember, if we're answering a lot of questions, then we're gonna need a lot of data and input. Early on, we talked about running and getting data, calling Billy who works at the competitor now and all that kind of stuff. Wouldn't it be great if you had a standardized set of things that informed most of your questions? And it's an organization exercise that doesn't take nearly as much time as you might think that it does. If you said, hey, here are the things I'm going to answer on the regular, and then ask the question, what information do I need to collect that, and what would it take for me to do that regularly, so that when the question arises, I know how to answer it using data. It's a couple-week exercise to go through that whole process to get there. And if you don't have the data available or accessible, now you have a backlog of data that you want to start to collect to improve your ability to monitor your program. And if you don't know by now, or if you don't know at this point in the presentation, if there's too much for you to do, that Monte Carlo simulation will point you to the data points that you're going to need to prioritize getting at. So we're going to talk about this thing right here. Who's heard of emotional data? Everybody in the room, right? Who's heard of transactional data? Everybody here. Who's heard of behavioral data? Everybody here. Our clients never ask us for these three things. They never say, can you give me more transactional data? They have that. They never say, can you give me more behavioral data? They're interested, they're curious, but they don't want that. They never say, can you give me emotional data in its raw form? They ask for very different things. They say, can you help me improve my experience, my member experience? Can you help me increase value and satisfaction? And can you help me improve engagement? So value and satisfaction is how people feel after they've transacted. Experience is how people feel while they're doing things. And engagement is how much they're spending while they're doing those things. Okay, so combining these data points starts to really inform what questions you can actually answer. So think of the long list. I'll show you how it ends up looking for us. So in one example, if we looked at emotional data and transactional data, we want to find out value and satisfaction. We can measure these KPIs. And right here, what you want to try to do is to minimize the number of data points to collect to answer the most amount of questions. So if you can start collecting, we have this thing up here called ELS. It's one of our proprietary tools. Emotional loyalty scoring is what it is. Many people have something like this, but ours is pretty specific because it gets right down to the customer level. So we say, hey, if we measure that, and I measure transactions and incentive mix by spend groups, if I look at the correlation of that emotional loyalty score to net promoter score, is there any kind of impact on these? If I look at offer and partner penetration and consistency by spend group, if I just did that, I could look at effectiveness of all incentives, effectiveness of my partners, alignment of incentives to customers' emotional loyalty score, and on and on and on and on and on. There's so many things you can do by just measuring these things. So get those in place, have a point of view on how you'd use that to answer those questions, so as they arise, you just pull open the drawer and here is the answer, so you know what to do with that. So on and so forth. The same thing happens when we look at engagement, and the same thing happens when we look at experience. Okay, is this making sense? So I'm going to pause here and just kind of get some conversation going with the audience. Who thinks that they could go back to their company and start to take all their data out of their drawers and throw it on a table and start to say, I'm going to sort this out by emotion, transactions, behavior, and I'm going to start to combine them on a spreadsheet somewhere, or at least tell somebody to update this on a regular basis so I can answer these questions. So I have a brave soul that's willing to tell me their ability to go after this. It's not really that hard, right? I mean, this all seems pretty intuitive to this group. I see heads nodding and things. And you see it, you see the vision of how this can come to life. This is actually where your roles stand apart from everybody else's role in the organization. You're literally the only person who can see this in your company. You're the only one who can lead this and direct the rest of the supporting parts of your organization to pull this together. Make sense? So elevate yourself while pulling these things off. All right. Relevancy questions. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're dead on. So look, in all of these, there's not a single company out there, no matter what people will espouse in their marketing material, that has it all ready, figured out, and whatever. So the impact is going to have an offset, which is your cost and your distance to get there. And that goes right into your Monte Carlo simulation, right? If you're nowhere near ready to act on a certain data channel or act on a certain communication channel, and there's going to be a Herculean effort, don't just run around saying, I saw it on YouTube and I think it's amazing. Right? You have to take that into consideration, and that goes into this is why we're not doing it, CEO. I know you saw this on your way into work. I know it sounds amazing, right? But your return on getting that figured out is not going to be nearly as impactful for us working on these other four things, right? So it's a fantastic question, but that absolutely goes into the consideration set. Yeah.
Would anybody actually rather have a Costco? I would call it. No, I'm giving it to you. Okay? Okay? Well, you're holding out on me here. Oh, you'd rather have the Costco? Just because you're not pretentious and you don't want it?
Yeah.
Got it. So you said
Yeah.
he has a personal experience on it. I love this because it was largely yours was against the Costco version. But now this is interesting. Who would rather have half
Yeah.
carrot Tiffany's diamond ring or a full carrot Costco ring? Who go to the Costco ring? Okay. So we had some people switch there. Who
Yeah.
stayed Tiffany's? They'd rather keep the Tiffany's half carrot.
I agree. You know, one of the beauties of, and you know, I gotta come up with a better word than Monte Carlo simulation. It sounds so weird and exotic, right? But it's a prioritization tool. One of the great things about having a prioritization tool is you know what the immediate next thing you can do for impact is. And when you know what the immediate best next action is, all others fall off. Your priority list of things that you have to work on went from 50, 20, whatever, to 1. Right? And then you work on that, and then you move on to the next one. One of the things we've adopted as an organization to help us with our goals is the 4 disciplines of execution. I don't know if you guys have read that book. It's a fantastic Kobie book, and it talks about wildly important goals. These are things that sit at the intersection of wildly important isn't going to happen on its own, right? And you can only do one of these at a time. And once you figure that out, what that is, you work on that, you knock it out, you move on to the next one. That's the principle that everybody should be applying to their loyalty program improvement efforts, is trying to figure out what's my next best action, how do I hit it, put the most energy from the company on that one thing, and then we can move on to the next one. Absolutely. Yep. And momentum gets more resources and everything, right? Yeah.
Program isn't just the financial return. We talked about we're doing more than just returning money to come one customer impact, customer reach, all this great stuff. Are they getting great experiential value, effective value, functional value? And do they feel like this is financial learning on the dollar? And the way to figure that out is to ask them. And so
Completely agree. So let's jump into the relevancy questions. And look, the relevancy questions should really feed your dashboard. Relevancy questions are things that you say, hey, I'm not paying attention to everything. Let me just kind of pulse check that and see if I should pay more attention to that on a more regular basis. And this is difficult because this is the actual introspection where you're questioning, am I thinking about things the right way? And that's a really hard thing to do by yourself. Find a buddy who's a challenger. Right? In one organization that I went to, they had a blue chair in every room. Every meeting room that they had. And the blue chair was somebody who was designated to be the voice of the customer at the table. And so every meet, this was Telefonica in the UK, right? So in every meeting, somebody had to sit there and be like, I disagree. You know, that was their job. This doesn't work. It's not my cup of tea, right? So, but it's a way to check yourself, right? And to just kind of ask yourself some questions. And I go through mental exercises on my own. One is around pricing and experience. And I always ask myself, is this worth it? Is it worth it to somebody else? Not me. Right? And here's my example of that. And sorry, at this point, my stories are old. You probably have heard all these little analogies at some point. But how much would you pay for a cup of soda? How much would you pay for a soda? $1, right? Okay. All right, but that's a common thing, $1, $2, things like that. But if you charged me with groceries and said, go get soda, and I brought back a 12-pack for $12, you'd be like, dude, I could have used that money somewhere else. That's a ripoff. But clearly there's a difference. You're probably thinking convenience at the vending machine or something like that. But would you pay $5 at the ballpark for a soda? Would you pay? What about the bar, right? Would you pay $8? Right? Would you pay at Disney, would you pay $12 for a soda? And the most I've ever paid, if it was the final installment of the Twilight series, the Jacob versus Edward commemorative cup, would you pay $18 for a soda because your wife wanted it? Yes, I did. And, yes. Yeah. Yes, you would, right? And so,
it's all about context. Price is about context.
Price doesn't matter. Okay, tell me the price you want to command, and I'll tell you the experience that you need to wrap around that price to make it sense. And it might not make sense to you to come up with that cost to overcome that thing. So I'm just saying that's something I used to check myself, saying this seems like a ripoff. Would it seem like a ripoff to my dad, to my grandma, to my kids, to my neighbor, right? And then I start segmenting the groups. So we're going to segment this group right here. Okay, this is probably the last time I'm ever going to do this analogy. I apologize to everybody who's heard this one before. But Tiffany's and Costco. Tiffany's sells diamond rings, right? Listen to the tone of voice here when I ask this next question. What color box is that Tiffany's?
So there's a range of
Green. It's come on. See, she's ready to get violent over this, right? It is Tiffany blue. Now look, a diamond ring is as commoditized as it gets. It is a rock on a piece of metal. Okay? And no, but it's not. The 4 C's are all the same. Don't try to trick me up with that, right? But Costco also sells diamond rings. Okay? So on the emotional scale, Tiffany's is really high. But on the behavioral or transactional scale, Costco's is much better deal. So I'll ask the audience, who would rather have a Tiffany's half-carat diamond ring? Everything's the same. Who would rather have that over the Costco half-carat diamond ring? Raise your hand. If everything's the same, I'll give it to you, right? You don't have to pay, okay? You'd rather have the Tiffany's, right? Would anybody actually rather have the Costco? No, I'm buying it. I'm giving it to you. I'm giving it to you, okay? Okay? Well, Cam, you're holding out on me here? Oh, you'd rather have the Costco? Just because you're not pretentious and you don't want the... Got it. So he has a personal experience on that. I love this, right? Because it was largely, the group was against the Costco version. But now this gets interesting. Who would rather have the half-carat Tiffany's diamond ring or a full-carat Costco ring? Who'd go to the Costco ring? Okay? So we had some people switch there. Who stayed at Tiffany's? They'd rather keep the Tiffany's half-carat over the full-carat. All right, keep your hands up if you stayed with Tiffany's. What if I matched that full-carat diamond ring with earrings and a pendant at Costco? Are you switching? When I do this with a large group of 500, we'll see it breaking by half, until I get somebody who, even though I'm offering a barrel full of diamond rings, they're like, I love Tiffany so much, right? And what we're doing is we're segmenting the audience. You're showing me your willingness to trade off, right? And that's because you have this emotional bias and you have this transactional bias, and each one of us are different on that curve of where we would swap those things out. And if we can just test our intuition and say my bias might influence how I'm thinking about this decision, let data start to pop up the answers. That's the pulse check I'm talking about. So that's the thing that you just kind of need to test all the time. I'm going to show you some examples. I do want to talk about these value drivers. One of the things that we do is we separate things by business value drivers and customer value drivers, right? The business value drivers are the things that we need to answer the internal questions to say why the program is relevant. You take all those questions that you're asking, you look at the dashboards, and you roll them up in a way where you can communicate effectively the value of the program. But the value of the program isn't just the financial return. Remember, we talked about we're doing more than just returning money to the company. We wanted customer impact, customer reach, all this great stuff. Are they getting great experiential value, effective value, functional value? And do they feel like it's a good financial or economic value for them? And the only way to figure that out is to ask them. And so we employ tools and research to ask them directly on behalf of our clients so that we never just look at the money side all by itself. Because the money side by itself is a very black and white story. You bring in this emotional side right here, you start to get to know who people are. We're going to spend a lot of time on a curve here, the remainder of the time. What are we at? Time check real quick. I got 5 minutes? All right, we're going to spend 5 minutes on this curve right here. This is actually a distribution of sales, or a distribution of visits, or a distribution of whatever you value from your clients. If you took the best and put them over here, and the worst and put them over here, it looks like this every single time. We've got some really high performers, and it quickly drops off into a long tail of people who you don't care so much about or are your greatest challenge, whatever you're going to say to feel good about it. And whenever we show this to our clients, particularly when we're looking at those numbers up there, how much they actually spend, I'll always get a C-level executive saying, how many are up there spending $20,000 at this grocery store of mine a year? And we're like, well, it looks like there's 100. Can I have their phone numbers? I want to call them personally and thank them. But we often talk about our customers in that light, when the reality is it's a lot different than just those high performers. This is actually a breakdown of what every industry out there that we serve looks like. So the curve is kind of the same. This changes out here. The more it's convex, is that the right word? The more convex it is, the more it is a common good that everybody has to do. That's grocery, the one that's on the inner part of there. And the one that's all the way on the other side is going to be banking. Right? And that's just how these curves always look. Well, we can use these curves to tell us some interesting information. So this is a curve for an actual, this was a prospect, and they gave us the information that we needed to help figure this out. It's not hard to do this. Go ahead and look at some of your clients, create a curve, and then just use that over and over again, because it doesn't vary that much. But when you look at this, we start to say, how does the program look in this visualization? And this client came to us and they said, we want a program design, but we're not sure that we need one. Can you help us figure out how effective our program is? And what we noticed is when we put where the gold tier was of spend and the platinum tier and then black, which was their highest tier, and we looked at that, we know that the distance from a threshold, only about 10 to 15% of the customers, or 10 to 15% of distance away from that reach, you can actually provide an incentive for me to do something more. In other words, 1 year, I flew one time on American. I'll never forget this. I probably shouldn't name it, right? I flew one time on this 1 year, maybe 15 years ago. It was December 1st. I got an email that said, congratulations, you are only 29,000 miles away from reaching silver. If you could only fly that in the next 30 days, then you too could be a silver customer. And I was like, how am I going to?